Hello, these are flip notes 4a part 6 in our unit on motivation, emotion, and personality. This section is about humanistic and trait theories of personality. My Bitmoji is looking in the mirror because a big part of the humanistic theory is the self-concept and different views of ourself. So let's get to it.
First, we've got the humanistic theories of personality. So, by the 1960s, psychologists were pretty unhappy with the theories of Freud, Skinner, and other behaviorists. They said that they were basically too dehumanizing, didn't feel like it painted humans in a very positive light, and that's where humanism started to show up. Primarily led by Abraham Maslow, who we know most famously for his hierarchy of needs. Humanists emphasize the idea that individuals control their own behavior. They generally view human nature in a more positive light, that we are innately good. And in general, their theories are much more person centered, which was different and kind of matched the ideas of the 1960s. Another big name that we associate with the humanist theories of personality is Carl Rogers. He also supported the idea of Maslow's idea of personal growth tendencies and the idea that people are naturally good. And the key idea of his personality has to do with the self concept, which is our perception of our own abilities, our own behaviors, and characteristics. If you have a positive self concept, according to Rogers, you tend to act in more positive ways. Rogers eventually would apply his theories quite a bit to therapy, and we'll talk about that in a later section, client-centered therapy. Rogers actually said we shouldn't refer to those we're helping as patients, but rather as clients because it changes their perspective of themselves. He said that a lot of therapy should be about paths to self-actualization. He said there's two different ways we think about ourselves, who we think we are, and then who we want to be. He said we should have positive self regard for people and for ourselves, and that we should show unconditional positive regard, which is where we give others acceptance and love regardless of how that person behaves, especially in the therapeutic situations. His self theory recognized that a fully functioning person is one who lives in harmony with their deepest feelings and impulses. Our self is flexible in our changing perception of our own identity. Our self image is our total subjective perception of our body and personality. Our ideal self is that idealized image of ourselves, who we'd like to be. And one of the key parts of his theory is the concept of incongruence, which exists when there's a discrepancy between what our experiences say is our ideal self and who we really are. So he looked at that and he asked people to describe themselves and who they would really like to be and who they thought they really were. And if our ideal self, our true self, and our self image didn't align, he said that we were at incongruence and that could kind of create tension for ourselves. So ultimately, the goal was for our personality to reach congruence, where with the ideal self, that we're basically living our best version of ourselves. Problems in evaluating this perspective, the humanistic psychology has had a really positive impact in the world of psychology, especially with counseling and therapy, child rearing, and management programs. But sometimes humanistic psychology can be kind of vague and lack scientific basis, and it can almost be a little too individualistic and lead to some self indulgence and selfishness. Our next category here are the trait theories of personality. So when we say trait, we mean our tendency to respond in a certain way in many different kinds of situations. So personality traits. Raymond Cattell is our next one, and he expanded from 3 traits to 16 key personality factors that he identified through factor analysis, that everyone has these to some degree on a continuum. And I thought I had those on here, but I guess I do not. So we'll talk about those in class. Hans Eysenck is our next one, and he basically said that there was a continuum of how extroverted or introverted you are, as well as how emotional stable and emotionally unstable you are. So he kept it a little bit more simple. The big one, and probably the most well-known one and most likely to show up on the AP test, is the Big Five personality theory, and it's considered currently the best approximation for identifying our traits. And it's sort of a combination of the work of Allport, Eysenck, and Cattell, so all 3 of the ones we just mentioned. And it identifies the Big Five personality traits as openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which forms the acronym of ocean or canoe. So with this, you score somewhere between the low and the high end of each of those personality traits. So in conscientiousness, this identifies how dutiful you are, dedicated to completing tasks, or the lack of it. Are you more impulsive, more careless, more lazy, or disorganized? Agreeableness measures a person's ability to be sympathetic, cooperative, kind, or the opposite. Are you more abrasive and irritable, suspicious, and jealous? Emotional stability versus neuroticism identifies individuals who experience things relatively easily without getting upset, or are you more neurotic? You're constantly angry or worried. You tend to look for the bad rather than the good in situations. Openness to experience is our last one. Describes, are we more open-minded and willing to try out new adventures and creativity, or do we resist new experiences and more predictable, conforming, and unimaginative? I thought that was our last one. This is the last one. Extroversion. Are we associated with warmth, talkativeness, being energetic? Or are we more introverted, quiet, shy, and cautious? In order to assess those big five, Paul Costa and Robert McRae identified the Neo Personality Inventory, where basically they asked 240 questions. It's a lot, and we'll look at a sample version of this that measures those big five traits. And then the results will show you kind of where on that continuum you fall for each of those five traits. Personality inventories in general are questionnaires that we use to assess traits. The most notable difference between personality inventories versus projective tests is that there's a really defined answer that you're going to say yes, no, agree, strongly agree, and that there's usually some sort of an actual key that we can determine meaning from your answers, whereas a projective test is much more open. The most well-known of the personality inventories is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or we just call it the MMPI. And we use this one to identify abnormal personality tendencies. So this one has been given to people who are clearly diagnosed with specific diagnosed disorders like depression and obsessive personalities. So we can see how they would answer certain questions. So it's a series of lots and lots of statements like, I have a good appetite, I am easily awakened by noise, I enjoy detective or mystery stories, I'm sure I get a raw deal from life. And you basically answer, yes, that's like me, or no, that's not like me. And how you answer will kind of identify where your personality fits and if you fit closer to like social introversion, more as a hypochondriac. So do you identify closer to people who have these diagnoses? Finally, some criticisms of the trait theories. Critics ask, do our traits really determine our behavior in every situation of life? Traits do appear to remain constant over time and across situations, but sometimes our behaviors can change. People don't act in predictable manners in all situations, but on average, our personality as a whole is pretty predictable. And that's because, according to this theory, because of our traits.